I thought I'd kick off by asking what is a drug in the sense of a psychoactive drug or a mind-altering drug, or what in public discourse in the media is called drugs. So this, I think, is curious because drug in this context is not really a neutral description, it's more of a label to be avoided. So alcohol and tobacco, for example, according to the industries that produce and promote them, are not drugs. Cannabis advocates would say it's not a drug but a herbal medicine, and advocates of LSD that it's not a drug but it's a sacrament. So it's a label that everyone's trying to avoid. And I think that's because it's a definition that's not strictly chemical, it's also got a large cultural component. One can't simply take a substance and say this is a drug. For example, model aeroplane glue, which becomes a drug when inhaled by teenagers. Substances like nitrous oxide or morphine are clinical drugs when used in clinical practice, but then become drugs in the pejorative sense when they're used for pleasure. So there's a component here which seems to depend on the character and the intention of the user and the cultural background. I mean, this sense of the word drug obviously is quite modern. It emerged quite cleanly about a century ago. Before that time, drug simply meant all medicines or anything you'd find in a pharmacy or whatever. So when we say kind of drugs in this modern sense, there are a couple of, it's a sort of shorthand, there are a couple of other concepts in there that are being elided. One of which is the concept of addiction. If you look at the first examples of use of drugs in this sense, that's drugs of addiction or drugs of abuse. So there's that sense, but there's another sense which is what's been elided, is that we're talking about a prohibited drug or a controlled drug or something like that, as opposed to, for example, a prescribed drug or an over-the-counter drug. So if we wanted to unpack this use of the term drug, we might say it's something like a psychoactive substance which lacks the cultural sanction for its non-medical use. So in this sense, obviously, it's an artifact of modern Western culture. And as such, I think it's a term that has a sort of curious distorting effect on other substances which are defined differently in their cultures of origin. So that's really what we wanted to do this morning, is open up this category of, well, let's call them hybrid substances with a spectrum of traditional uses, some of which might be social or ceremonial or ritual, others of which might be medicinal or dietary, but substances which also are psychoactive. So in that sense, they fall into the category of drug and are subject to statutory controls and bans in world markets. So in a bit, I'd like to get Dr. Axel Klein to talk about kat, which is a stimulant leaf chewed in East Africa and Yemen. But first of all, I'd like Dr. Pien Matal to talk to us about coca, which is a stimulant leaf chewed in Andean South America, where Pien has lived for a long period of time, and since 2002 she's worked for the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, who are one of the world's leading policy and research centres on global issues of drugs and development. And the focus of her research and engagement has been on policy issues around coca and cocaine. So Pien, perhaps you could start off just by clarifying briefly, how would you sort of characterise traditional use of coca in the Andes, in its country of origin?